Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. In today's episode, we will be discussing the situation around India's LPG supply. And to throw some light on the cause of it, on 20th February, US and Israeli strikes against Iran began, and the conflict quickly escalated into missile strikes, drone attacks, and airstrikes across the region. Iran retaliated by threatening and attacking the Strait of Hormuz, which we all know is a critical global energy choke point. Tanker traffic in the strait has dropped sharply, with many shipping companies suspending operations. You can find some analysis of the crisis in our previous episodes. But in the light of this scenario, today's discussion will focus on India's LPG supply constraints, which we are facing following the conflict. So I am Bhumika Sevkani, and with me today I have Anisree Suresh, a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution, to unpack the situation and also examine the possible alternatives for India in the face of this crisis. So welcome, Anisree, and if you could just highlight the three key points that we're going to discuss in this episode.
Yeah. And first of all, thank you, Bhumika. I think it would be a really interesting discussion given that our social medias and the news reports already focusing a lot on the LPG crisis, and people are aware of okay, is there a supply shortage, and there's a lot of panic and uncertainty around it. So we'll be trying to unpack those things. Along with that, we'll be trying to focus on the government interventions in the LPG sector, and in the past as well as in the present, and what are the impact of of these government interventions in the LPG supply as well as the demand. And second, we'll be also looking at what are the immediate solutions in the face of an acute shortage in the LPG, what are the possible pathways that India can adopt and all those things. And also, as a long-term strategy, we would be also looking at what are India's long-term energy security strategies, especially when it comes to cooking fuels and all those things. So that's the larger the areas that we want to cover through this podcast.
Right. So that's interesting, Anisree. And before we move on, just again, I'd like to take a minute to set the context of why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much for India, right?
Yeah.
And so we know that around 20% of global oil and natural gas trade passes through this narrow sea route. And the route connects major producers such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar to Asian markets. And India is one of the world's largest LPG consumers. However, our domestic production only meets a part of our domestic demand, which is about 40%. And around 60% of the total LPG demand is met through imports. And even within that, more than 90% of which is roughly 20.5 million metric tons of LPG imports in 2024 came from these West Asian suppliers, with most shipments routed through the Strait of Hormuz, which now we see is completely blocked. And just to highlight this distribution, which will, I think, help while we look at the government sort of actions that are being taken. So around 85 to 87% of India's LPG consumption is in the domestic or the household sector, with the rest being in the commercial and the industrial usage.
Yeah.
So let's dive right in, Anisree, now. Could you take us through the various actions that the government has taken, not only in the current situation, but also the past incentives that have shaped the LPG sector as we see it today?
Yeah. So there are a lot of interesting facts about India's energy security and the imports and everything. But for the today's interest of this conversation, I want to focus on three things. One, the subsidy program that we have with respect to LPG. And then second, let's also look at the distribution channels and everything, and the recent intervention as well by the government considering the conflict and the tensions in the West Asian region. So first, the subsidy program. like you mentioned, India is one of the largest LPG consumers, and most of it is driven by the expansion in the household cooking gas connection. And one of the main reasons for that expansion is due to the subsidy schemes, such as the Pradhan Mantri Jala Yojana, which you can claim that it has doubled India's household consumption in the last decade, since 2016,
Right.
when it was like introduced, right? So India's total LPG coverage has expanded to around 33 crore connections, with the Ujjwala Yojana scheme kind of accounting for about 10 crore households. So like one third of it is like the PMUI subsidies, right? So the average annual LPG consumption of the PMUI households has also increased from around like 4.85 cylinders per year, compared with around 3 cylinders in the early phases of the scheme as well. So that means like the average consumption in Indian households with respect to LPG has drastically improved,
Right.
or gone up in the last couple of years. And India kind of delivers over for 55 lakh cylinders daily across consumer categories, right? So one thing you have to understand is like this subsidy was introduced like because a lot of rural households have used like firewoods and this biomass kind of thing in the initial stages, instead of using the LPG. So the objective was to reduce the indoor pollution and focus more on LPG and everything. But the challenge, like you have earlier mentioned, is like since we import a lot of the LPG and our other energies mix and everything. So the most of it, like while we have increased the demand, the supply was based on West Asia and everything. And unlike our oil, LPG is doesn't have a lot of diversified sources. Even when it comes to imports, is mostly focused on West Asia, like you have rightly mentioned in the introduction that you have given.
Right.
So that's one aspect. So the demand had gone up. Now, if you look at the distribution channels, right, the supply. So supply, again, two aspects. One, there's a higher dependence on the import. And the second, if you're looking at the supply aspect, the distribution channels, they are mostly state-owned oil marketing companies, right? So that means like the 90% of the market share of this distribution channels of LPG for household mostly share goes to the state-owned oil marketing companies. So we have like primary oil marketing companies in India, such as under the public sector undertakings are like Indian Oil Corporation Limited. You have the Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited and the Hindustan Petroleum Corporation Limited as well. So they mostly concentrate the 90% of the LPG distribution channels in India, and it's a very wide network. It reaches the remote areas of India, and it runs huge storage units, the cylinder network, and all those kind of things. So we have established that huge network through this public sector undertakings, right? But the problem is, so you have the subsidy program that increased the demand, and since most of this demand is met by the public owned distribution channels, so indirectly there is a what do you say, a kind of a price ceiling. Like it's not exact price ceiling, but since most of these are met by the public undertakings, the price do not act as a signal.
Right.
So usually it's fine because it's public sector undertakings, like they usually incur a lot of losses for running these subsidies and everything. And government, I think last year or something, the IMC compensation of around 30,000 crore has been approved against the losses of approximately like 40,000 crores. So government kind of reimburses that amount to the IMCCs. And usually it works well. And the private distribution channels are relatively less, in the sense they mostly focus on this commercial sector distribution for like restaurants, hotels, and all those things that you can buy off the, top the counter kind of thing. So that's the network system that we have. But the problem is like here, when you have a if you look at the usual demand and supply graph and everything of any product, when you have a supply shortage, usually the price goes up. That kind of stabilizes the demand over the time, and we reach a new equilibrium, right? That's how the demand supply match happens usually. But since the price is not I mean, the price has gone up by 60 rupees because of the really shortage, and the price at which we are getting the imported LPG from many of the countries have gone up. And that has to do with a lot of the insurance going up because of the the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, and you have to take a longer route, like a lot of other issues with that. So that's why like the prices have gone up definitely, and that led to like a 60 rupees increase in the LPG in India as well. The problem is like here, usually when you have a really acute shortage, the price usually goes really up, and that stabilizes the demand. But given that we have a subsidy and we have a public sector undertaking, the price do not act as a signal here, right? And it kind of like, while we have a lot of uncertainty about the usage, how I mean the availability of LPG and everything, there's also like a less incentive for people to actually start looking at the other alternative, because price is not the problem here, more of the availability of the thing itself.
Right.
Then I want to focus on the other aspect, that is like, since the crisis has started in West Asia, the government has invoked the Essential Commodities Act of 1955 to regulate the production of LPG uh, in India. So the LPG control order, which was issued on 8th March 2026, directed all refineries to maximize the LPG yields and channel the entire output of C3 and C4 hydrocarbon streams comprising propane, butane, propylene, and butanes exclusively to the three oil marketing companies for domestic cooking gas, the three OMCs that we mentioned earlier. Hence, in the last couple of days, like, LPG production has been increased by 28% through refined directives, and further procurement is actively underway. And that's the government notification about these things. And they also increased the 25-day minimum booking gap has been introduced as a demand management measure in urban areas, and 45 days in rural and Durgam Kshetra areas. So while these introductions are, there's also like a another notification which kind of says that, like, the 20% of the commercial LPG distribution has to be rechanneled to the other priority areas, which is the domestic consumption and everything, while you keep a 80%. But the so I'll come to that. So the why the government has done that is basically they feel that the commercial LPG has been regulated in this scenario, in this crisis scenario, to prevent black marketing and to not to penalize the hospitality sector. But the stated objective is basically by the government is that the commercial LPG is sold in a completely deregulated over-the-counter market at a market price without any government subsidy. So they feel that there's no registration system, no booking requirement, no digital authentication, or no delivery confirmation mechanism. So any business or individual can purchase cylinders in any quantity at the point of sale, and that was the situation. And there's no government control, right? So they felt that this uncontrolled pathway could lead to hoarding, diversion, and resale at inflated prices. So that's why they felt like, there needs to be some kind of restriction on the cylinders purchased over the counter, and that shouldn't be diverted to the gray market or the black market at the expense of commercial consumers and domestic households alike. So that's the stated objective, they said. But there are a couple of problems with this stated objective. While the objective is like genuine and looks like a valid concern, the problem with like prioritizing household consumption is that while it's only like 20% redistribution to household from commercial sector, due to this shortage, there's a supply issue in the commercial sector, and it kind of exacerbates that existing supply issue, right? And the other part is like it discriminates. While we say that 20% is distributed to the the household consumption item, it inadvertently discriminates the population that are dependent on restaurants and hotels. And it's not just always the affluent community, right? You have a lot of migrant communities, you have a lot of students who live in PGs, you have a lot of like young professionals who like migrated to new cities, and a lot of these urban migrant population and migrant population elsewhere, students who live in PGs, they all would be disproportionately affected by this, who actually are those people who live away from homes, and there's a lot of economic activity associated with these individuals, and also those people who do not have a home in that sense. Like, so this they have been dependent on certain things, and suddenly those sectors are severely affected by this. So I think there's a problem with this mechanism because it leads to inequitable distribution at a time of a crisis, and that leads to a lot of panic and uncertainty. And of course, it does affect a huge segment of the restaurant and hospitality industry of all price points. We're not looking at the most affluent or elite restaurants or anything, but it's also small shops, small these things who been dependent on this. So it affects the industry or section of the economy as we speak of, right? And it all has certain unintended consequences as well, because food not able to the uncertainty related to it, it all creates a lot of panic among the urban population especially. And it might could lead to certain kind of productivity impact in our cities as well. And again, another problem is, while the objective was to block the it leading to black markets and gray markets, I think while there are a lot of efforts to underway it, including this policy itself, I think the one of the unintended consequences of this, since you reduce the supply to the consumer LPG sector, it leads to the black market, the very objective this policy was trying to stop it. So that's one of the problems. And so to summarize all this government interventions, so due to this deprioritization of the commercial sector, instead of price acting as a signal, instead of that the price goes up at least in the commercial sector, and that will regulate the demand, it exacerbated the supply problem. And so due to subsidies and the kind of a price ceiling that we have through this public sector undertaking, the incentive is also missing for people to reduce the usage and actually think of the alternatives that are more sustainable for a household and all those things. So it all leads to a problem of a demand supply mismatch due to this, all these issues. And price is not acting here as a sector. That's something that I want to end. And the inequitable supply that's disproportionately affecting a segment of the population.
No, right, Anisree. Thank you so much for that detailed analysis of all the government actions. And I think one key takeaway from your analysis that I think is very important is how demand management is very important in this situation, and how that price signal plays an important role in it as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, while considering that this is an essential commodity in a way, you also have to see that at a time of acute crisis, price also acts as a a clear signal, and that incentivizes people to look further. So I think now we understand the problem clearly, right, Bhumika? Oh, I hope so. But now I think the very important question that we have to look at is what is our immediate solution? So I know that the government has been undertaking or planning to do some diversification and everything. Could you throw some light into it, what India is trying to do? Will that actually solve the problem that we have, or is it going to get worse? What is your analysis on that?
Yes. So when we look at a supply shortage, there are usually two things that we resort to, that we turn to, right? And the first is we look at our reserves, and the second is obviously that we try to diversify our supply sources, both of which is already in action. So first, if we were to look at the reserves, some reports mention that we do have 25 to 30 days of cooking gas stock. But again, we know that we have two underground storage anchors with around 140,000 tons of deep storage. But up to what extent are they utilized is currently uncertain. And these were the storage. And these storages were only opened up, I think, in late 2025.
Yeah.
So again, we're unsure of how much reserves do we have in these storage currently. But the second option that we're looking at is diversifying our imports immediately. So and we've already done this. India is trying to import more LPG from countries like the US, Norway, Canada, Algeria, and others. So, and particularly from the US, we we had a deal in late 2025.
Yeah, I think around November, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah. So that mentioned that that was a 1-year deal where we would import about 2.2 million metric tons of LPG from the US in 2026, and the first shipments had already started coming in January 2026. Right. So, but there are a couple of problems with alternative sources of LPG as well. Right. On why our imports were concentrated in the West Asian markets. So the first and foremost thing is the blend of the LPG that India requires. The blend of the LPG that India requires between propane and butane is the 60-40 blend. But the LPG that we source from the US has a different blend, which is propane heavy, right? So that is one thing. And even if the US LPG is cheaper, there's a trade off in the freight costs and the timing that it would take to reach India is longer. So while cargoes from Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and UAE would typically reach Indian ports within 7 to 8 days, shipments from let's say United States or other countries are going to take between anywhere between 25 to 45 days.
Yeah.
Right. So but again, in the immediate term, that is the only solution that we can look out for.
Yeah. Given that the prices have gone up everywhere. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So those are the two things about diversifying our imports and about our short-term solutions to the problem. But so India consumes about 31 million tons of LPG annually, and as we mentioned, 87% of it is used in households. Immediate alternatives, of course, include your diversifying supply sources, increasing domestic production, again, which is also something that we've seen through the government directives. But the timeline within which this immediate solution can solve the crisis is again slightly uncertain. And a medium term solution that I would like to highlight here is that we can um, we can increase the infrastructure of blending units at our import terminals, right? The problem that I mentioned with the LPG blend in sourcing from different countries, that is limited. That solution is limited by the obstacle of the different blends. And while we're sourcing from the US, we're sourcing pre-blended LPG as per Indian requirements. And the export terminals in the US that can supply us this particular blend are also limited in number, which is why we cannot increase our imports from other countries, right? So this is one solution that I could think of, is that we could improve or increase the infrastructure for blending units at our import terminals, which will allow us to source from different suppliers regardless of the blend, and then we can change it according to our requirements. But again, this might take a little longer, maybe a year or so.
So you need some infrastructure tweaks at the import terminals to make the blend and all those
right
things.
That's right. And lastly, for the long term, of course, the only option is diversifying the means and fuels used in our households for cooking and other uses, right? So some of the options that are well known are PNG, e-cooking or inductions that are currently sold out everywhere. But yes, focusing on PNG, as of late 2024, India had just around 1.36 crore domestic PNG connections, which only represents like 4% of the total consumption that is required. So expanding, I think, PNG pipeline networks in the long term is an option. And I know there are some issues with where PNG can be adopted. So again, we can look at it in different geographies, right? Another option that I can think of is alternative fuels like community biogas, as well as centralized biogas. That again requires a lot of infrastructure addition and planning from the state, and it is also dependent on feedstock availability. But that is the way forward. We can identify the obstacles in the adoption of these alternative fuels and reshape incentives to diversify our energy consumption mix, right? So let's just say the community biogas, if it's more suitable for rural areas, that is we can expand the adoption of community biogas in rural areas, while PNG can focus on the newly developed, the periphery of the cities that are being newly developed, so that the infrastructure that is necessary can be laid out from the beginning, or the semi-urban areas. And whereas centralized biogas can again be another long-term option. So these are the alternatives, the strategies that we can look into long-term to diversify our energy mix.
Yeah, so just wanted to highlight something here. So, like, it's not saying that we have to completely move away from LPG, but we need a much more like a mix of different sources. Like you rightly mentioned, I think PNG already we have certain kind of networks built in the west of India, so we can like start focusing on that. And tier 2 cities maybe where we have a lot of space to do this, like pipe networks and everything. I think that's a really good solution.
Absolutely.
And of course, community biogas with LPG could be one of the solutions that we can look at for the rural India. And of course, urban India should have more options. And so, yeah, I think that's really a good long-term strategy. And going back to your immediate solutions, I think diversification and certain infrastructure tweaks is the only solution that we can think of.
Absolutely.
But yeah, we would be happy to know some more inputs from our audience as well. Like, let us know, write to us if you have any thoughts about it. And thank you so much, Bhumika. It was a really interesting discussion and really a timely one. And I'm really happy to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Anisree. Thank you for joining me today. And I hope the audience found this episode insightful. Stay tuned for more such episodes. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.